First of all, is there anything you want to comment on, like on Rishi's talk in terms of operationalizing sustainability and his sort of approach to provide using AI? Anything resonate with either of you?
Well, I think for me what resonated, and we talked just a second about this, is technology's role in climate change. And IBM, like Salesforce, we're all trying to figure out how to use our superpower to help our customers move faster. So that really resonated, and I think it's a great use case for IBM and the expertise and products that they've built over the years. So
let's talk about nature-based solutions. What makes a nature-based solution better? It seems like every solution should be nature-based. What is that definition, and how do you see some of those applications?
You want to start?
Sure. Yeah, so in the Biden-Harris administration, we're seeing nature-based solutions really broadly. So basically any investment in nature that benefits both the environment and people in any way. So obviously there's potential for mitigation benefits, but there's many, many other social challenges and social benefits that can be provided through nature-based options. And I agree with you, everything should have a nature-based solution. Maybe not everything, but a whole lot of things can. And it's certainly the position now of the administration to start there, right? All else equal, think of nature first until you can rule it out as an option.
Cool.
Yeah, and we heard about fusion. We heard about CDR, the great work that Microsoft's doing with carbon removal technologies. We think about it like the kind of rainbow of carbon, right? So the green carbon, which are forestry-based projects, blue carbon, we're doing a lot with mangroves. Currently, brown carbon, there's people here that are working a lot on regenerative agriculture, and gray carbon, which are the new technologies, the carbon removal technologies. I think all are really important, and our portfolio is made up of all. We're not doing much in the gray carbon space yet, but we're excited to learn and do more in the next 5 years. But we love investing in nature because I think to Heather's point, not only is it a great model for carbon sequestration at scale, but there's so many additional benefits around biodiversity and food and ecosystem development and clean water and infrastructure and jobs. And so nature provides, and the return to nature in places that have been degraded in particular, provide a lot more than just the tree itself.
So let's talk about trees for a moment. We do have this beautiful creation that is a natural carbon sink. We cut a lot of them down. We built our civilization using them. Planting more trees will make the world a better place. How is that going? I know both of you have worked on initiatives for reforestation. Is planting more trees the solution here?
Well, there's been some really good research, and we always go back to the science as a place to start on, what the multiple pathways are for nature-based carbon sequestration or greenhouse gas mitigation, and there are many, right? So trees are very powerful, especially keeping trees in place that we already have, so you don't have to build back the carbon stores that are already there. But there's lots of other ecosystems, too, that do a pretty strong job. You mentioned mangroves, a type of tree, but a coastal one, salt marshes, grasslands can be incredibly large carbon storage systems with their natural soils and their root systems in place. So lots of clear evidence on the different ecosystems that have carbon storage potential, and also on the different management pathways and what their potential is. And so keeping existing ecosystems in place is the best bet when we can, when they're likely to be lost, and then restoring trees at a landscape scale, so forest landscape restoration. Not necessarily planting individual trees, but it's restoring forest landscapes is the next best bet. And there's really good science down the list of what those options for management are and what their potential is.
We've mentioned mangroves a couple of times. What is it about mangroves that make them so effective?
Well, and just sort of back on the tree thing, I'm with you on the conservation as the most important thing. Restoration, also important. We're doing some work in some of the the fire scar areas in California from 2018 and rebuilding those ecosystems in a way that mitigates, at some level, sort of future fire risk is really important. And then the planting of new trees, also important. So we sort of think of them in that stack rank order. Mangroves, I've had this sort of accidental degree in forestry over the last 3 years when we started this initiative called atrillion.trees.org with the WEF. And I've learned a lot, and I still don't know so much. But mangroves sequester 5 times as much carbon as a terrestrial tree does. And also think of the food systems and the fish that grow in there. They also are hugely important storm barriers, especially for coastal areas that are getting hit hard with climate change. It's a very cultural, the people at the center is so critical to our strategy, and how you have to think about nature. But it's for the communities in which these ecosystems live, there's just tons of other benefits around jobs and livelihoods, et cetera.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce your point about structure. I don't know, how many people know what a mangrove forest looks like? Many of you.
Well-traveled.
That's pretty good, yeah. But so, I mean, the point is they're either pretty dense with trees, or some have these prop roots, right? So it's like a whole system of structure that really acts as this barrier to incoming waves, and they live right there on the coast, sometimes right in the water, right? So they're this frontline defense against sea level rise and incoming storm surge. It's just incredibly effective for reducing waves and flooding.
So there, you talked a little bit about the indigenous populations and looking at this on a global scale. Maybe just talk a little bit about how nature-based solutions can really revitalize these communities and provide jobs and provide not just the storm barrier, but also like a whole economic system.
Yeah, I mean, indigenous knowledge is really an essential part of addressing the climate challenge. The White House put out this year the first ever guidance to federal agencies on indigenous knowledge, really firmly recognizing the importance of indigenous knowledge as evidence. And we have seen a real resurgence and openness to learning from those millennia of experience for nature-based solutions. Much of what we know about those options comes from indigenous knowledge in Native communities. And just as one example, I've recently learned about an interaction between the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico and the Army Corps of Engineers, where they've worked together to use the Santa Clara Pueblo's approach to using native materials for flood risk reduction as something that the Army Corps now supports and works with them on their own lands.
Let's talk a little bit about oceans. We want to get oceans into the program. Oceans offer a great opportunity, but it's also a resource that needs to be managed. Can you describe some of the nature-based solutions for managing our oceans?
Yeah, you could probably go a little bit deeper here. We do have an ocean scientist on staff. People are like, why does a tech company like Salesforce have an oceans expert? Largely because she's teaching us a lot about how to invest in blue carbon as part of our portfolio. She also does a ton of work with kelp. And it's all connected, right? And if you just think about the ecosystem, again, one of the things I've learned is that the San Francisco Bay Area has lost 95% of its kelp, fed right in through the ocean. And when you don't have a kelp ecosystem like that, you not only lose the fish and, comes down from a species perspective, but also from sort of a cleanliness and being able to sort of keep it clean, in addition to the kelp as a carbon sink as well. So it all feels really connected, and the oceans are what of our land mass, 2/3, and are really taking the brunt of the carbon right now, which you see through coral reef bleaching, and so that's partly why we're trying to figure out this pivot to enabling more trees and nature-based solutions that are sort of on the ground to take the heat off the oceans, if you will, a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pathways for ocean-based climate solutions, some of them nature-based and some just through, for example, shipping, which is a major opportunity to shift fuel sources and uses that's a major part of the climate picture. I want to give one example that I love that ties together all these different areas of innovation through an ocean-based lens, and that's DARPA, the part of the Department of Defense's research program, is funding an initiative now called ReFence. And they are funding innovation in coral reef restoration because we know coral reefs are these really, really important, thriving places of life in the ocean, but they also slow down waves like the mangroves do and have this real buffer potential. And so they are funding one project along the coast of Florida that's innovating on the structural engineering to sort of give coral a head start to have some kind of built infrastructure that's not concrete-based and contributing to climate change, but giving the kind of surface that the coral needs to settle on and that slows down waves while the coral gets going. They're innovating on the material science and sort of a biofilm to cover that material so that coral can settle and grow. And then they're innovating on what we know about the coral biology itself, how to use the natural variation in corals that are more resilient to heat stress, which is killing a lot of coral, and disease, so that they can restore and recover the coral itself faster. So it's this sort of like triple entry point into innovation and thinking about the different components of that ocean system that can, really build defenses for the coasts.
That's a great example. So you guys are have similar goals, but are approaching it from two different angles. We've got the private sector and the public sector. I think it's amazing how much the private sector is now taking this on. The fact that you have an ocean scientist on staff speaks volumes about your corporate culture. But like, how is this? How do you guys get along? Like, how is the business and
me and the ocean specialist, or me?
Like the two coming from those two different philosophies, like. What is the state of like public-private partnerships at this point?
I think it's never been stronger in some really key areas. Where I was talking earlier to, carbon markets right now. A lot of companies are really afraid. The greenwashing, good old John Oliver, who sort of put it out there, called a number of people to the mat. And there's this green hushing thing that's now happening where people just don't want to talk about what they're doing. And there are some projects and some bad actors that the media has pointed out, to sort of kind of criticize the investment in nature in particular. And the way that we think about it is, first of all, you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. These are really important projects at scale. There's, of the 95 out of 100 are good. We diligence them like crazy, and we use rating systems and all the things on top of it. But where we've had some of the most success is in our public-private partnerships. So we were talking this morning to another corporation that we work with, and we were talking about the LEAF Coalition, which is basically a jurisdictional approach to forest management in places like a state in Brazil, so that you have this different level and of oversight, and now there's great sensing technologies and satellite imagery that we're using. But when you come together with a government to do it, well, we work very closely with the U.S. Forest Service and the USDA here in the U.S. Those are mechanisms for scale and oversight that a company couldn't take alone.
Yeah, I'd say we get along. And there's just no way we're going to get to the scale and pace of change we need without the private sector. There's just no question about that. And so there's tons of interest in how we do have more partnership and how we do find the ways forward. And I think there's huge roles to play. We just put out a call to action last week on investing in nature, inviting everyone to contribute to investing in jobs, youth, and resilient cities and communities through nature. So that's open right now, and will be for the next year. We're really encouraging a lot more activity and joint action and partnership on these kinds of investments. And I just really want to emphasize there's so much more to do beyond carbon credits, right, or direct investments. So that's really important, and just one role that the private sector has to play. And I'll give one other quick example. I recently visited Oklahoma and met someone on a local water board, and they were talking about a recent bid they put out for part of their water management infrastructure of a reservoir system that needed to be updated. And they put out a very conventional bid for what they need to solve this problem, and they got multiple proposals, one of which had nature-based features. They didn't ask for that, they weren't thinking about it, and when they saw it, they all knew it's what they wanted. So there's a huge role to play in just putting it out there, right? Proposing something with nature as a starting point. And it's clear in some cases, right, that's giving a competitive advantage.
Yeah, and I just another example, it just made me think about, for us, it's way more than carbon projects. And the pandemic actually really, in a way, helped people return to nature in a powerful way. You're stuck in your home. You could do is walk around your neighborhood for a good amount of time. And I was thinking about that. So I had my global team was here, and our volunteer activity is working with the Park Service. So seedlings is an issue right now, and seed banks. And so we went out and kind of helped the Park Service with what they're working. So you can think of it as carbon, but we have 70,000 employees that we can get out and active in nature. And what we've really learned is that in a kind of polarized society, nobody can argue with a tree. And every country has a tree as it's what it, whether you're bonsai in Japan or there's something really sacred, and it doesn't matter what age you are, what race you are, what political part of the spectrum you are. It's a really nice bridge in a kind of working in a polarized world. So it was sort of a accidental learning that we had over time as a way to kind of really bridge people together.
Yeah, that's a great point. No one can argue with a tree. I think I work with some people.
At least I haven't found anyone yet. If you have problems with trees, see me later.
So we've got a couple of minutes. I want to see if we've got any questions from the audience. We've got one in the back there. That mic is way far away from you.
Should I just yell?
No, she's coming. I should have given her a heads up.
Hi, Graham Hill from the Carbonauts. I just was curious if you could give us a little bit more on the Army Corps story.
Sure, I'll say what I know. Basically, there's the Santa Clara Pueblo's a community in Nevada where there was a large wildfire in the lands that the tribal community is on. And the year after that, as is common, there's big floods and landslides in the areas that are burned because everything's destabilized with the trees being affected by the fire. And so then they were responding to Army Corps funding opportunity to build back some of their flood protection abilities so that their community is safe and stable and they don't have that flood risk. And when they sort of went for that Army Corps funding, some of the ideas that they wanted to use were not conventionally what's paid for or allowed practices under that kind of flood risk reduction support. And so they spoke with Army Corps of Engineers representatives and talked through with them what they wanted to do and worked through a joint understanding of how they could use some of their traditional approaches to reduce flood risks in ways that they knew about. And the Army Corps is willing to support that. It's now an allowed set of practices. It's things like using rock and tree falls on the landscape to build flood risk reduction sort of infrastructure from those nature-based and natural resources in conjunction with more gray or built options. So that's now a type of practice that's allowed for use of Army Corps funds, and so other communities now can put forward those kinds of ideas and use the funding for those kinds of approaches. That's awesome.
Very cool. Do we, also in the back, and then I want to make sure we get to the sides of the room too.
Hi, Ron Erd from Unlocking Growth. I wondered if you could tell us what are some of the challenges with measurement and verification on these nature-based solutions, and how you deal with those.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's working. I was saying to someone at dinner the other night, when you're working in a voluntary, unregulated market, it's a lot of fun. So I think there's a lot of maturity that has to happen in this market over the next 5 years. Some of the challenges are, the standards are, there's not one standard, right? And there's Vera, who's sort of the mega standard provider, and they've been recently criticized. So if you can't count on the standards body, what do you do? We've got a venture fund, and so we've invested in some raters. I think I'd mentioned those, Silvera, Calyx, who are using a lot more satellite LiDAR technology on the ground spot checking. I think, when a company like Salesforce invests in a product in Myanmar, which we've done before, how do we know that's real and it's going to stay there over time? It's really working with the local communities, the local partners, using as much satellite imagery and LiDAR that we can get over time. But it's been a real issue in the afforestation. I think that's been the trickiest bit, where you sort of say, we're protecting this forest, otherwise it was going to be cut down. And can you really verify that otherwise it would have been cut down, or how much of it would have been cut down? So, I think standards, the rating agencies, there's a lot in flight and movement right now, but I still don't believe you should back off the investments.
Thank you so much. This is a great conversation.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.